Well, Göbekli Tepe is for me part of a bigger picture for my personal point of view, because I did not start my ancient studies by looking at Göbekli Tepe. In fact, I was studying ancient civilizations before Göbekli Tepe was even generally known, before it was first excavated, even the most preliminary excavations by Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who unfortunately has passed away, but I did have the good fortune of meeting him on site and being able to talk to him about it. But we need to go back. Personally, I need to go back further. I was interested in ancient history, ancient civilizations, really as long as I can remember. It goes back to when I was a very young child. But moving fast forward, I went to college. I earned degrees in anthropology / archaeology and also geology, separate degrees in this, both sciences, both scientific fields. I then went on to graduate school at Yale University, where I earned a PhD in geology and geophysics. After that, I became a faculty member at Boston University. I'm still a faculty member at Boston University. And in the late 1980s, so this is over 30 years ago, what he called himself an independent Egyptologist, John Anthony West. He approached me first through intermediary, another faculty member that he knew at Boston University at the time, and he approached me as a geologist, as a professional geologist and geophysicist, to look at the Sphinx, the Great Sphinx in Egypt, because John Anthony West, based on the work of another person who died, I think it was 1961, Schwar de Lubitsch, R.A. Schwar de Lubitsch, he got the idea that maybe the origins of the Great Sphinx were not 2500 BC, but much, much, much earlier, by thousands of years. So really, it was a geological question, because the basis for this very, very, very tentative hypothesis at the time was that the weathering on the Sphinx did not look right if the Sphinx dated from 2500 BC and had only been subjected to hyper-arid Sahara conditions. So I was invited by John Anthony West to first go to Egypt in 1990, and the dates are important here, 1990, to look at the Sphinx from a geological point of view. I went there very, very skeptical, because I thought that my fellow Egyptologists, my fellow academics, they would certainly know when the Sphinx had first been carved, what its origins were. I thought this John Anthony West seemed like a very nice fellow, very sincere, but I was very skeptical about what he was suggesting. To put it crudely, it was a free trip to Egypt. I didn't get paid, but I also got my expenses paid. So that was sort of fun. I'd never been to Egypt before. Little did I know I would be going back and forth to Egypt to, I don't know how many times now, literally dozens of times. But that's another story. So I go to Egypt in 1999. I'm sorry, not 1999, 1990, 30 plus years ago now. And I was amazed when I first got there. I still remember to this day when I first stood in front of the Sphinx as a geologist, looking at it as a geologist, and I saw that there were problems with the dating according to Egyptologists, because it was quite evident that it sure looked like precipitation erosion, rainfall, water runoff on the body of the Sphinx, and even more so on the walls of what's known as the Sphinx enclosure, because the Sphinx is carved down into the bedrock. So they had to carve away the rock around the body. And on those walls, those limestone walls, there is incredible and obvious evidence to any trained geologist that this is from water runoff, from precipitation, from rainfall from above. It's not from Nile floods. It's not from water or flooding from below rising up into the enclosure. It is from runoff and rainfall. That meant immediately that there was something wrong with the dating of the Sphinx, that it must go back to a much more moist, temperate period, pre-Sahara. If that were the case, we're talking pre 5,000 or so years ago, minimally, which means that it's before when civilization is supposedly existed. According to all the dogma at the time, civilization only went back to 3,000 or 4,000 BC at most. From the level of precipitation, the weathering, the amount of rainfall that would have been necessary, I could quickly estimate that it had to go back much earlier. Furthermore, the head of the Sphinx was too small. So this was 1990. I stress the date because I presented this to the geological community in 1991 at Geological Society of America meeting. Then the Egyptologists were literally up in arms. There was an outpouring of should we say, disgust and attacks against me. How dare I say that something so sophisticated could have its origins so much earlier? And in 1992, the American Association for the Advancement of Science actually organized a conference, as part of their conference, a symposium on the age of the Sphinx, where the Egyptologists lambasted me, attacked me, the geologists supported me, the geological evidence. This is now 1992. They asked me, where is there other evidence of sophisticated civilization, of monumental architecture that could be thousands of years earlier than 3,000 or 4,000 BC? So they're asking me this in 1992. A couple of years later, German Archaeological Institute, the Turkish archaeologists, and above all, I credit Klaus Schmidt, Herr Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt, began, of course, excavations at Göbekli Tepe. But I want to point out this was a couple of years where after I'm talking about the Sphinx. So suddenly I hear about Göbekli Tepe and Klaus Schmidt is talking about, I remember very clearly when I was reading the first initial papers, he was talking about major construction at Göbekli Tepe, 10,000 to 8,000 BC. And I said, this is incredible confirmation of what I've been talking about, monumental architecture and structures thousands of years earlier than circa 2,500 or 3,000 BC, because the traditional date for the Sphinx is 2,500 BC. And I said, of course, they were using it in 2,500 BC, but they were restoring it. They were recarving the head. The origins of the Sphinx goes back much earlier. The Egyptologists said this is impossible. No one could do anything like that at such an early period. Now we have Göbekli Tepe. So to me, Göbekli Tepe is absolutely central confirmation of what I had already been asserting based on the Egyptological data, the Great Sphinx in particular. And so for me personally, it's very, very important. And I'm not trying to get some kind of personal glory. Oh, I was right, and here's the confirmation. That's nice enough. But what's important is that we, in my opinion, have underestimated in the past how far back civilization goes, how sophisticated people were at a very early age. And I'm a geologist. I'm a geologist above all else, perhaps. That's my PhD, geology and geophysics, and something that long before I was thinking about Göbekli Tepe or the Sphinx, I've been thinking about the Ice Age and the catastrophes that occurred at the end of the last Ice Age. And I am now absolutely convinced that the origins of the Great Sphinx, the origins of Göbekli Tepe, the this, what I call an earlier cycle of civilization, it goes back to before the end of the last ice age. And it goes back to this very, very early period. So, to make a longer story short, we have evidence of high culture, sophistication, both in Egypt and Göbekli Tepe at, let's just use for round numbers, 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. The Ice Age, and this is very, very well dated, the Ice Age ended incredibly suddenly. I'm now speaking as a geologist in 9,700 BC, give or take just 1 or 2 years, literally just a few years. But we know it happened very quickly. We know it happened within a year. We actually know that based on ice core data, which is very, very precise, that you can look at the Ice Age and the ending of the Ice Age, and it happened literally in a snap over a couple of weeks to days. So this is incredible in and of itself. We have Göbekli Tepe and the Sphinx going back to before 9,700 BC. I'm absolutely convinced based on the evidence of both sites, which I won't go into great detail here. I will mention that one thing we did was I did this with Dr. Thomas DeBecke around the Sphinx in the 1990s. We did seismic studies, which allowed me to look at subsurface weathering of the rock also and calibrate that, which allows me to analyze it and support my assertions that the origins of the Sphinx go back to, let's say, roughly 10,000 BC. It's been reworked heavily since then. But we have the end of the last ice age, something I've been interested in for a very long time. We have these civilizations decimated, this early cycle of civilization decimated at the end of the last ice age. Why? And this is the most recent part of the story for me, it is the sun. It was the sun that literally exploded at the end of the last ice age, underwent what now some people are calling a mini nova, but basically probably a series of huge solar flares, what are known as coronal mass ejections, etc. It was very agitated. It snapped us out of the last ice age, caused devastation on the surface of the earth, intense heating very, very quickly. What would this do? This would melt glaciers at high latitudes. It would evaporate water, immense quantities of water. The atmosphere can only hold so much water. It would come down as incredible precipitation, rains. Think of my work on the Sphinx, my early work. Where did all that rainfall come from? I think it tied in with the end of the last ice age. So now I'm seeing a cogent story that we're putting together based on the evidence that we had this early cycle of civilization. It was devastated by a solar outburst, is the term I like to use for it, that caused all this destruction on the surface of the earth, including huge flooding, precipitation, rain, extinction of large animals that could not go underground because the best way to escape is to go underground. So this is a time, and this is well known in the geologic record, that large mammals, for instance, around the world went extinct. And a colleague of mine, Paula Violetta, who's a physicist, for instance, has calculated that with a solar outburst like this, you will have very high radiation levels on the surface of the earth, that if you could not escape them, and the best way to escape would to be go into caves and other underground areas, you would collapse and die. Now, it's interesting that human populations did not survive in many areas. One place where we know that a population did survive was in Anatolia, in the Cappadocia region in particular. Well, what do we find there? This tradition of going underground. And yes, I've studied those underground structures in Cappadocia. I've been there many times now and had a chance to explore them. And yes, of course, they were used later by maybe in Roman times or Byzantine times, etc. But I believe the origins of them, the first initial concept of going into the rock probably start with natural caves, then they expanded them. And so you have this tradition of going underground to escape. And I believe it goes back to this early time. Interestingly, for instance, there's so much evidence here to put this all together. For instance, linguists have traced back the origins of many Indo-European languages to this very region and to this very time, the end of the last ice age, because you have a pocket of humanity that survived and then spread out again. So this is all part of the bigger picture, and Göbekli Tepe, I think, is absolutely central to this story, this picture that we're now putting together.